Hi, everybody. I'm sorry that I'm not in New Zealand to give my paper, but I'm delighted that we are given the option to do papers online through H France. So thank you all for organizing this conference, even though we're not in person to talk about papers. My paper today is called Le Marronnage dans le monde atlantique, sources et trajectoires de vie. Marronnage in the Atlantic World, Sources and Life Trajectories. It's really about, the title of my paper is the title of a digital humanities project on the history of slavery and slave resistance in the French Atlantic world, in particular, that originated back in 2009. It's been about 11 years, and I'm told that for a DH project, it's a pretty good time. It's a pretty long span. Here's the screenshot taken from the Marronnage website as it exists today. I will tell you the story of the website in the next 20 minutes. The website really, the database, the Marronnage database, brings together about 15,000 runaway slave advertisements, as you can see on the map on the screen, published in French Guiana, Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue, Jamaica, Louisiana, South Carolina, as well as Canada. About 15,000 runaway slave ads published in the newspapers of those slave societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. We also have about 7,000 prison lists. In particular, those published in Saint-Domingue in between 1764 and 1791. Altogether, the corpus we have put online is made of over 1 million words, and it testifies to the acts of resistance of over 22,000 men and women in those plantation societies. Men in particular, about 17,000 of them, 4,293 women. I believe, I don't know, I mean, most people are familiar with a runaway slave advertisement. Here is one taken from Les Affiches Américaines, the main newspaper of the colony of Saint-Domingue, published between the early 1760s and the early 1790s. A runaway slave ad is usually made of a short description of an enslaved man, woman, or a group of enslaved men and women. The average slave ad is about 120 words, depending on the society we talk about. In Saint-Domingue, there are very short ads like the one on the screen about un nègre nouveau, Nation Congo, so an enslaved man who recently arrived from Africa. And we know pretty much nothing about him except for the branding mark that he had on his body, a C inverted and an H. Other ads are a bit longer, like this one. This one is taken from the prison lists from Saint-Marc. So prison lists give a detailed, usually not so detailed, description of the slaves who have been captured. This particular ad is about Antoine, a slave from the Congo nation. And it's also about a woman, the name of whom we don't know. Runaway slave ads sometimes, they're not difficult to find in newspapers. Most of them are announced by a title. Others like on this particular page from the Saint-Domingue newspaper, the Affiche Américaine, others which is buried right after plantation houses and other slaves for sale. On this particular page, we have animals for sale, and at the very bottom left side of the page starts the list of runaway slave ads. Why am I interested? Why? The project Le Marronnage dans le monde atlantique started from my interest in runaway slave advertisements that I developed as part of my dissertation, which I did at Paris 7. It all started in 2002. I defended in 2007, and My dissertation was on runaway slave advertisements published in Louisiana, Jamaica, South Carolina between 1800 and 1815. My hypothesis, the hypothesis I wanted to prove, was that runaway slave advertisements were much more complicated sources than we had originally thought. And the thesis I wanted to prove was that runaway slave ads differed from one plantation society to the other, and that runaway slave advertisements, in most cases, were not really written to recapture a slave, but they were written as part of an attempt to make sense of the absence of escaped men or women. Runaway slave ads, according to my thesis, were proto-narratives or proto-slave narratives about acts of resistance in the plantation societies of North America, the Caribbean, or Latin America. On the screen here, you can see some of the runaway ads I accumulated during my dissertation research, about 5,000 of them for Louisiana, Jamaica, South Carolina, and I transcribed them and put them in a database, which later became actually the prototype for the Marronnage DH website I'm talking about today. Runaway slave advertisements are well known because, as Shane and Graham White have put it, they became sometime in the 1970s, 1980s, one of the staples of the historiography of 18th century slavery. And a comment that they made in 2005. Another comment that is of interest to us today is the one they made in 1995. And at the time they said that the analysis of runaway advertisements has become the standard coin of works on 18th century slavery. Runaway slave ads were used extensively in the 1970s and 1980s by historians who tried to put slave agency back on the screen. And runaway slave ads were the perfect sources to write a history of slavery and slave resistance from the bottom up. There are plenty of them. There are hundreds of thousands of them. They're short documents. They seem easy to decipher. And so historians from John Hope Franklin to Daniel Meters, including Philip Morgan, have used them again and again. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, something interesting started. Historians published anthologies of runaway slave advertisements. The first of which is Lathan Windley's Runaway Slave Advertisements, a documented history from the 1730s to 1790. So that's the first anthology of runaway slave advertisements that was published in the States. Followed many anthologies of runaway slave advertisements published for North Carolina, for Georgia, other states, other slave states. And the anthology moment lasted until the late 1980s, when Billy Smith published an anthology for Pennsylvania and states around there. The publication of anthologies stopped at the end of the 1990s because of the development of the internet. So it became too costly. It was too costly, actually, to publish runaway slave ads that could be used in classes or, to educate. It became too costly to do that on paper, and it became rather cheap to do that online. For a very long time, so let's say in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, runaway slave ads were seen as very not complex sources for historians. As I said earlier, Daniel Meters in 1975 claimed that the runaway ad has as its most important function the fact that it may be used as documentary evidence to illuminate the complexity of slavery in the United States. So Daniel Meters, among many other historians, explained that runaway slave ads were not, racialized or racist sources. Masters were just trying to, recapture their properties, and to do so, they gave a picture, a portrait, as accurate as possible of their human belongings. I disputed, as I explained that earlier, I disputed that fact in my dissertation. runaway slave ads are a very popular source. I said so. They were popular in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and that popularity never stopped, surprisingly, despite the historiographical term. Runaway slave ads are still a very popular source, as this footnote taken from my forthcoming book shows. Damien Pagas has written on runaway slave ads. Mary Mitchell from the University of New Orleans. Simon Newman has a very interesting piece, a DH piece on escaped slaves in late 18th and early 19th century Jamaica in the William and Mary Quarterly. It has, runaway slave ads have had a very, very long life, and apparently historians are not tired of studying them. There's a recent film that was made about slavery in Scotland that was based on runaway slave ads, and quite recently, surprisingly, new anthologies of ads were published, one of which was authored by Antonio Bly. You may be familiar, some of you may be familiar with the numerous DH projects that have been created since the late 1990s, early 2000s, in order to make accessible runaway slave advertisements in a manner that is how can I say that? Anthologies are costly and they're big. Runaway slave advertisements, DH projects are, easily accessible. So historians have tried to move away from paper to DH projects to make runaway slave ads more accessible. One of the ancestors of the DH projects on runaway slave ads is the Geography of Slavery in Virginia, a website created in 2005. This website was really a replica of the first anthology of published runaway slave advertisements in 1983. Another DH project is this one here. It's a digital library of runaway slave advertisements for North Carolina for 1750-1865. It's really a database, put online. There's no particular search. I mean, there are a couple of search options, but it's just, really a transfer of, a transfer from paper to the web. One of the most recent projects, DH projects on runaway slave ads, is the Runaway Slaves in Britain project that Simon Newman has headed in Edinburgh. It's quite a fascinating project, really, that brings together all the runaway slave ads published in Britain in the 18th century. The most ambitious DH project on runaway slave ads is the one headed by Ed Baptist and Mary Mitchell, Freedom on the Move. Freedom on the Move aims to digitize, transcribe, and make accessible pretty much all the runaway slave advertisements published in the US. From the beginning of slavery to abolition. Now, this short presentation so far, I think, has shown that I haven't talked much about France and the French Atlantic. There are, surprisingly, runaway slave advertisements published in French colonies or French plantation societies have hardly, have attracted little attention from French scholars or scholars working on France and slavery in France. And there are plenty of ads published in Martinique, Guadeloupe, Guyana, Saint-Domingue, La Réunion, Louisiana, but none of those, very little of those have been studied as they have been in the US and the Caribbean. It seems that in their attempt to stress the importance of slave agency in French societies, in the French slave societies, historians have hesitated to study the lives of the enslaved and to see how agency functioned in French slave societies. Now, one particular, I mean, historians of France, or French historians, have worked on the opposition between Petit Marronnage and Grand Marronnage, with which you may be familiar. Petit Marronnage designates, those slaves who escape for a few days, and Grand Marronnage refers to, attempts of enslaved men and women who, wanted to live in the forests or live in the mountains or live in cities. Now, this distinction, Petit Grand Marronnage, is very problematic because, in a sense, it has become more important in historians' work than the lives of the enslaved themselves. Petit Marronnage and Grand Marronnage, tends to I'm not sure how to pronounce that in English, but tends to establish a hierarchy between, the men and women who escaped just for a few days or a few weeks, and, the heroic slaves who actually managed to live on their own and found communities in a forest or in the mountains or in cities. Now, this hierarchy doesn't really work when you look at the archives. Most men and women who escaped did not try to found independent communities in the mountains of Saint-Domingue or in the cities of Martinique or Guadeloupe. Most men and women who escaped for, usually short periods of time, but they escaped not necessarily to found, free societies, but to express some sort of agency that responded to particular contexts. Gabriel Debian, the historian Gabriel Debian, is really I would say, the French historian who has worked most on runaway slave advertisements and marronnage in the French Antilles. He published extensively in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s on the topic of slave resistance, but he did so quite often with a paternalistic view. He doesn't really consider les petits marrons, those who escape for a few days, for a few weeks. He doesn't really consider those men and women as important characters in the history of slavery in the French Atlantic world. Marronnage has been pretty a hot topic in Saint-Domingue, in Haiti, in particular because of the Duvalier dictatorship. So from the 1950s onward, François Duvalier uses the figure of the marron, of the escaped slave, as a way to legitimize and to justify his dictatorship. So in Haiti, even today, the history of marronnage is pretty much an angle mort. I'm not sure how to say that in English, but it's pretty much a part of the history of Haiti that hasn't been explored. Because when Haitian historians think of marronnage, they think of the Haitian Revolution. They don't really think about those men and women who had non-revolutionary goals before 1790. There have been some DH projects in France related to the history of resistance to slavery in the French Atlantic. None of those projects, which are, very exciting and useful, none of them give the possibility to users to actually explore sources. So the DH projects on slave resistance in France, on the French Atlantic world, are very static, top-down projects. Quite often. A few examples. One of the DH projects prepared by the CNMHE, le Comité National pour la Mémoire et l'Histoire de l'Esclavage. Another project is the Slave Trade Rescla pedagogic website, which is very useful, but again, very top-down, and it doesn't allow people to search the sources. Which is what runaway slave advertisement anthologies in the US allowed users to do, to ask questions. There's also a DH project called l'Histoire par l'image, which is very official. It's I think it's headed by the Ministère de la Culture. And there is one section on le marronnage, but it's a section really, again, that shows one newspaper from French Guiana, but it's impossible to search the newspaper in order to, teach, create projects, research projects, start MAs or. So this is why in 2009, my colleague Léon Robichaud and I started this DH project that we first called Histoire d'Esclaves, le Marronnage à Saint-Domingue, Histoire, Mémoire, Technologie. This is the ancestor of the Marronnage project that is online today. In 2009, we thought we would focus on Saint-Domingue only. So on the 1760s, 1790s, we digitized all runaway slave ads and all prison lists about runaways published in Saint-Domingue between the early 1760s and the early 1790s. We databased those ads, we transcribed them, and we rendered them accessible to users at the end of 2009. At first, as you can see on this slide, we wanted to allow users to search runaway slave ads in a variety of ways. You could search the names of the slaves, the places where they lived, when they escaped, their ethnic origin, the language they spoke, their occupations, their branding, their marks, their body marks. We thought we would have enough money and enough people to actually database all this info from all the runaway slave ads we accumulated. Soon enough, we realized that it was far too costly and far too lengthy to do all that. So we decided to, as you can see, we were very optimistic in 2009, even though we had very little money, but our research assistants had to enter the transcription of each ad, and then they had to enter the info, the age of the slaves, their height, if it was known, if they were African or Creole, if there were new Africans or not. But it took really a lot of time, and soon enough we exhausted the money we had. So we decided to change the search interface in 2010, I think, 2011. And we also decided to change the title of the DH project. The project was called Histoire d'Esclaves, and now it became Le Marronnage à Saint-Domingue. The reason why we did that is that because we presented the project at UNESCO in December 2009, and we were told that the title of the project, Histoire d'Esclaves, was really not appropriate, because in a sense, the runaway slave advertisers were not Histoire d'Esclaves, they were Histoire de maîtres. There were, stories written by masters, by men and women who had in common, to build white power in Saint-Domingue. So we changed the title, and we changed the perspective on the project from Histoire d'Esclaves to simply Le Marronnage à Saint-Domingue. Then the second version of our website, in the second version, you could search the corpus by word, by slave name, by sex, or by year. But we pretty much ditched all the other search options because it was too costly to enter the data in the database. From then on, the Marronnage info, I think, was successful. The Marronnage info website was successful because we wanted, historians and community activists. We wanted students and teachers to actually use the ads in order to change the perspective that we had on slave resistance in the French Atlantic world. And I think from a historiographical point of view, the French Atlantic world is behind, way behind the US or the Caribbean or the literature published in Great Britain. So from 2010 onwards, people like Deborah Jensen, like André Thibault, the linguist in Paris, they used our website in order to create new and innovative research. The website is referenced again and again on Google Books. Trevor Bernard and John Garrigus in particular quote the website, use it in their research. We partnered with people at Duke University, Laurent Dubois, Deborah Jensen, and their students in order to, analyze the data that we had rendered accessible. One of the examples of one of the results of our partnership is the website Haitian Marronnage, Voyages, and Resistance. Here are some statistics of how the website has been used since its creation. We have attracted, quite a few users. Those statistics are from 2016, but at the time, we had 15,000 different users, and the website is used on a constant basis. It's used more when we add data or when we do updates. But I suppose, for a DH project that cost about, $70,000 Canadian dollars, it was a pretty good result. Most of our users are from the States, Haiti, France, Canada, India, I'm not exactly sure why, the United Kingdom, Brazil, Germany, Senegal, a lot, Martinique, Australia, Guadeloupe. Running out of time, I guess, so I'm going to talk about now the third version of our website, which is, I think, the final version of it. We changed the title, we changed the data structure, and we changed the design because we wanted a website to last. And for that, we had to, change the technology, I guess. So we had to reprogram the website, which we did in 2016. And we gave it a new title, Le Marronnage dans le monde atlantique, sources et trajectoires de vie. The reason why we changed the title again is because we added data. We focused on Saint-Domingue at first, and then in this third iteration of the website, we added data for Guadeloupe, for French Guiana, Jamaica, South Carolina, Louisiana, Canada. So the website became, Marronnage in the Atlantic world. And the stress, really, what I wanted the website to stress was that the website was about acts of resistance, but it was also about sources that open a window on life trajectories. And I do think that as we write and rewrite a history of enslaved resistance in the French Atlantic world, we need to stress the importance of life trajectories. It's important to go from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. As you enter the website, you are confronted with a map that shows you where the runaway slave ads that we have in our project were published. This is what really differentiates us from other, the Ed Baptist Freedom on the Move project. The Freedom on the Move is about the US, and our project is about the Caribbean, the French Caribbean in particular, but also Canada. And I would say that Louisiana really is part of the Caribbean, I suppose, at the beginning of the 19th century. Here's the new search interface that we created, much more user-friendly. You can search any word in the ad. You can search the ads by specifying the sex are you interested in, men or women, enslaved runaways. Then you have the option of choosing, the place, the plantation society where the ads were published, the name of the newspapers, and if you want to see either runaway slave ads or prison lists. Pretty much all the slave ads, all the slave ads have been transcribed, but we don't have the digitized image for all the runaway slave ads, most of the time, but not all of the time. Right now, we have about more than 22,000 documents in the database. Now, some concluding remarks. A DH project can be, sometimes it's difficult to see what the end of a DH project is, because as long as you have money and as you have people in interest, there's so much you can add in terms of data. Just imagine, we could add the runaway slave ads of Martinique in Canada, which we want to do in the short term, but you could add data for French Guiana that we haven't found. We could add data for La Réunion, of course. So there's so much you can ad all the time, and you know, sometimes you don't see the end of it. I really want our project to be ended, to have an ending point. Because you know, I think this is how research works. You need to have beginnings and ends. So the end for us is going to be Martinique in Canada, and I think it's going to be the end of the project. What I'm hoping is that this ending process, which means no more, you know, applications for money. This ending process will open the door to something else. So it's going to be an end, but beginning at the same time. I'm really hoping that the more people use our website, the more they see the importance of integrating the notion of enslaved resistance in French historiography. Runaway slave ads were pivotal in how the history of slavery was rewritten in the US and the Caribbean in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And I'm hoping that we can achieve the same result by integrating the history of runaway slave ads in the French Atlantic world. Thank you.